The wagon had been sitting in front of the post office for 20 minutes when Nora Callahan finally let herself look at it. It was not much of a wagon. One wheel had been replaced with mismatched wood, lighter in color than the rest, and the seat had a crack running along the left side that someone had patched with a strip of leather tied through holes punched by hand. A man sat on that seat with his hat pulled low against the September wind, and beside him, pressed against his left arm, was a child. On the flatbed behind, two more children sat close together, sharing a blanket the color of old grass. Nora looked back at the letter she was holding. She had read it so many times the fold lines had gone soft. The letter was from a man named Gerald Whitmore of Caldwell, Kansas, who had written to the agency in St. Louis 4 months prior to express his interest in a widow of good character and steady habits. He was 38, a cattleman, no children, 160 acres under deed, and he expected to arrive in Hartwell, Nebraska on the 14th of September, 1884. He would be driving a brown wagon. The wagon outside was brown. But Gerald Whitmore had written no children. Nora folded the letter along its soft lines and put it in the pocket of her coat. She was 34 years old. She had a daughter named Clara, who was 6, and she had $12.40, and she had a room above the dry goods store that the owner, Mrs. Peterson, had made clear was only available through the end of October. She had been a seamstress, and before that a schoolteacher, and before that a farmer's daughter from Iowa, and she had been a wife for 3 years until Thomas Callahan rode out to check the eastern fence line one morning and did not come back. The creek had been running high. The search party found him 4 miles downstream. That had been 2 years ago. She had written to the agency because Clara needed a roof and Nora was tired of being the only wall between her daughter and the wind. She stepped out of the post office into the September air. The man on the wagon seat did not look up immediately. He was saying something to the child beside him, something low, and the child nodded and sat up a little straighter. Then he looked up. He was not what she had expected. The letter had said 38, but this man looked like he had spent all 38 of those years outside. His face was weathered and still, and his eyes were the color of creek water in winter, gray and quiet and direct. He looked at her the way people looked at things they were trying to understand, not judge. She stood at the edge of the boardwalk. He was still on the wagon seat. He took off his hat, holding it at his side. "You must be Mrs. Callahan, I must be. And you are not Gerald Whitmore." His hair was dark and going gray at the temples. He turned the hat brim once in his hands before he spoke again. "No, I am not. My name is Emmett Hale. Gerald Whitmore is my brother-in-law. Was my brother-in-law. He passed 6 weeks ago. Fever took him fast. He told me, before the end, that he had made an arrangement, and he asked me to come in his place and explain. He felt it was only fair to explain in person." Nora looked at the wagon. The child beside him was a girl, maybe 8, watching Nora with an expression that was trying hard to be invisible. On the flatbed, the 2 smaller ones, boys, had stopped pretending to look at the sky and were watching her openly. "Those are yours." "Yes, Martha, she is 8. The boys are Samuel and George. They are 5 and 3. Gerald Whitmore wrote that he had no children. Emmett Hale met her eyes without flinching. Gerald was a bachelor. I had a wife. She died in the spring. Nora let that land. And you came here. With 3 children. To explain. I did. That is a long way to come to explain something you could have written. He was quiet for a moment, not from uncertainty but from choosing his words carefully. Gerald asked me to come. I owed him that. And I thought, if you had made arrangements, traveled here, left something behind to be here, you deserved to hear it from a person, not paper. The September wind moved between them. Down the street the livery door banged open and shut and banged again. Nora asked where he was staying that night. He had not decided yet. He had been told there was a boarding house on Elm. There is. Mrs. Draper runs it. Tell her Nora Callahan sent you, and she will treat you fair. She turned and walked back into the post office. She stood at the counter and stared at the wall of sorted boxes for a long moment. Harlan Bice, the postmaster, pretended to be very busy with something behind the counter. She asked if he knew a man named Emmett Hale. Name does not ring, Harlan said, looking up from his ledger. He hear about the Whitmore correspondence? Apparently, she asked if there were any other letters for her. There were not. She walked back up the stairs to her room above the dry goods store and sat on the edge of the bed where Clara was sleeping through her afternoon rest, one fist tucked under her cheek, her dark hair spread across the pillow. Nora sat and watched her daughter breathe and thought about $12.40 and the end of October. Clara asked about the wagon children at supper. She had seen them through the window of Peterson's store while Nora was buying thread, and she had pressed her nose to the glass for a full minute before Nora pulled her away. They are visiting, Nora told her. They are from Kansas. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said the little one had a rabbit. Nora said she had not seen a rabbit. Clara was certain. It was in his pocket. Just the ears were out. Nora thought about this and told her to finish her bread. That night she lay in the dark and did the arithmetic she had been doing for months. It did not come out different, no matter how many times she ran it. She had enough for October. She did not have enough for November. She was a good seamstress, but Hartwell was a small town, and there were 2 other women who sewed, and winter meant less work, not more. She had written to her sister in Omaha, but her sister had 4 children of her own and a husband who worked the stockyards, and the letter back had been warm and sorry and not an invitation. She was not afraid of work. She had never been afraid of work. She was afraid of the specific arithmetic of not enough. She needed a situation where her work counted for something. She had been very clear about that in her letter to the agency. She had said she wanted a partner, not a rescue. She had not expected to be explaining this to the dark ceiling of a room above a dry goods store in September of 1884. In the morning, she walked to Mrs. Draper's boarding house with a basket. She was not sure why. She told herself she was making a neighborly call, and she did not look too closely at that reasoning. Mrs. Draper answered the door with flour on her apron and mentioned that the Hale party was in the dining room having breakfast. She said it the way she said most things, which was with full awareness of the information she was transmitting. Nora said she would leave the basket at the door. She was 3 steps down the porch when she heard the voice. Small, precise, a child's voice doing its best to be an adult. The girl Martha was standing in the doorway in a blue dress that had been let down at the hem not long ago, the old line still faintly visible. "Papa said you might come," Martha told her. "He said if you came I should say thank you for the recommendation about the boarding house. Mrs. Draper is kind. She is. You tell your father he is welcome." Martha looked at the basket and asked if it was for them. "It is just some bread and a jar of put-up peaches. Nothing special." Martha said they had not had peaches in a long time. There was no performance in it. The girl was simply reporting a fact. Nora felt something move in her chest like a door that has been shut a long time and is now uncertain. She set the basket on the top step, told Martha the bread was from yesterday but still good and the peaches from this summer, and left before the girl could say anything more. Emmett Hale came to the dry goods store the next morning. He was not there to see her. He was there to buy nails and a length of rope. And she was there because Mr. Pedersen had asked her to help organize the bolts of fabric in the back storeroom, which was a kindness dressed as employment. She heard his voice at the counter and stayed where she was until she heard Pedersen say that Mrs. Callahan was working in the back, and then there was no graceful way out of it. She came out with a bolt of brown wool under her arm. "Good morning, Mrs. Callahan. Good morning, Mrs. Hale." She set the bolt on the counter. "How are the children settling?" "George found a cat behind the boarding house and has been trying to bring it inside for 2 days. Mrs. Draper is firm on this point. She would be. He mentioned that Martha had asked him to pass along that the peaches were very good." Nora began straightening the edge of the fabric. She was glad to hear it. He said he wanted to ask her something, and that he wanted to be plain about it so there was no confusion. She looked up. "I came here to explain about Gerald and to make sure you were not left without any word. I have done that. But I find myself wondering if there is anything that would be of use to you while I am still here. I do not mean to overstep. I only mean that you came a long way and made arrangements, and the arrangement fell through, and that is not nothing." She looked at him. He was holding his hat in both hands, turning it slightly at the brim. Not from nerves, she thought, but from something more like care. "What did you have in mind?" "I do not know yet. I thought I would ask first. Pedersen was very busy with his ledger at the far end of the counter. I do not need charity, Mr. Hale. I did not offer any." She studied him for a moment. "What do you need? You have 3 children, and you are in a boarding house in a town you do not know. What is the actual situation?" He looked at her directly. He had a farm outside Caldwell, he told her. Good land, but the house needed work before winter. His sister Gerald's wife was there with her 2 boys and managing, but barely. He had given Gerald his word, and he did not go back on a word, but he was going back within the week regardless. "Then you will go back?" "Yes." He paused. "Gerald's letter described you as a woman of considerable capability. Gerald never met me. No, but the agency gave him a full account, and he passed it to me before the end. He knew you had been a schoolteacher, a seamstress, a farmer's daughter, and that you had kept a household through 2 years of very difficult circumstances. He said that was the kind of person he wanted to meet. He said it with some feeling." Nora was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry he did not get here." "So am I," Emmett said. "He was a good man." They stood in the dry goods store with the September light coming through the front windows and the smell of sawdust and dried beans around them. "Tell me about the farm." She did not agree to anything that morning. But she asked questions. The farm was 112 acres, about 60 in crop ground and the rest in pasture. There was a house, 4 rooms, that needed the roof patched on the east side before winter. There was a barn in better condition than the house. There were 8 cattle, a team, 2 pigs, and a kitchen garden that his sister had kept going since spring. There was a school 3 miles away in Caldwell proper that Martha had attended the previous year. She asked about the sister. "Her name is Ruth. She married Gerald when she was 19, and she is 26 now. She has 2 boys of her own, James and Peter, ages 4 and 2. She is steady and she is kind, but she is also tired. Gerald was the one who understood farming. Ruth understands it less, and she will tell you that herself." She asked about the nearest neighbors. He told her the Prentice family was a mile east. An older couple, quiet. A man named Dowd had the property to the south and was not what Emmett would call agreeable, but kept to himself mostly. "What happened to your wife?" He was quiet for a moment before he answered. "Childbirth, the baby as well. March of this year. She said she was sorry." He thanked her. The bolt of brown wool was still on the counter. She smoothed the edge of it with her thumb. "I have a daughter. Clara, she is 6. She is quiet, but she pays attention to everything. Martha would like a girl to talk to. She has been the only girl in the house for a long time. I am not saying yes to anything. I know. He had not asked anything. That was true. He had simply answered her questions and held his hat and let her think. Give me 2 days. She spent one of those days pretending to be deciding, and one of them knowing she had already decided. The numbers were still the same. October, and then nothing. She could write to Omaha again. She could ask Peterson for more work. She could write to another agency and begin again, months away from any result, with winter already leaning against the door. Or she could look at what was in front of her. She knew what people would say. She was aware that going to a farm in Kansas with a man she had spoken to for 3 days would look like desperation to some and foolishness to others. She was aware that it was not the arrangement she had made, and that Emmett Hale was not the man she had agreed to meet. But she also knew the difference between a man who came to explain because he had given his word and a man who would have sent a letter and been done with it. She went to Mrs. Draper's on the second evening after supper. The children were in the side room when she arrived. She could hear George, the youngest, talking to something in a sustained monologue, which she assumed was still the cat situation. Martha came to the door of the dining room and looked at her, then looked at her father, then went quietly back to the side room in the manner of a child who understood more than was intended. Nora sat at the dining room table. Emmett poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot Mrs. Draper kept on through the evening. I have some conditions. He set the pot down. All right. Clara and I would have our own room. Private, with a door that locks. He agreed without hesitation. He would expect nothing less. I am not a housekeeper. I am willing to cook and to help with the household work because that is how a household runs, but I am not hired help, and I do not want to be treated as such. Understood. I will look at the situation, and if after the first month it is not workable, I need to be able to say so and be heard. That is fair. I am not in a hurry for anything beyond the practical. I do not know you. You do not know me. I am willing to find out over time what this is and what it might become, but I am not willing to call it something it has not yet earned the right to be called. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had spent a year watching Gerald write to the agency, and he had spent some of that time thinking Gerald was being foolish and some of it thinking Gerald understood something he himself had missed. The point, Gerald had told him, was not to find someone who fit a picture he had in his mind. The point was to find someone whose presence made the work of a life easier and better. Gerald had said that was as good a reason to build something with a person as any other. She held her coffee cup. He sounds like he was a thoughtful man. He was. I will come to Caldwell. He looked at her. Not with relief, more with the steadiness of a man who had been holding something carefully and could now set it down without dropping it. Thank you, Mrs. Callahan. My name is Nora. If we are going to do this, I would rather start being plain about what to call each other. Emmett, good. We will leave Friday. They arrived in Caldwell on a Sunday afternoon, 6 days after they had left Hartwell, having stopped 2 nights along the way. The land opened up as they came south, and Nora noticed the way Emmett's shoulders settled once the shape of the horizon became familiar to him. A man who knew his own country. The farm came into view from a low rise. It was not beautiful in the way of paintings. It was beautiful in the way of things that had been worked. The barn was solid and well kept, and the kitchen garden, though mostly given over to the end of the season, had the orderly bones of something that had been tended all summer. The house sat square and plain with a porch on the south side and a smoke trail rising from the chimney. Ruth was on the porch before the wagon stopped. She was small and fair with dark circles under her eyes, and she looked at the wagon and then at Nora, and then at the wagon again, and then she put both hands over her mouth for a moment. She came down the porch steps. You actually came." She said it to Emmett, but she was looking at Nora. He made the introduction quietly. Nora Callahan and her daughter Clara, his sister-in-law Ruth Whitmore. Ruth repeated the name Nora as if testing the weight of it. Then the words came fast, like pressure finding a release. She had been managing the canning, and the east fence had come down last week, and James had a cough since Tuesday. "Show me the canning first, and we will get to the fence." Ruth looked at her for a moment, and then something in her face went from brace to open. "Yes, come in." Clara had found Martha on the back of the wagon, and the two of them were looking at each other with the particular intensity of children taking measure. George was already down and moving toward the barn. Samuel had climbed to the highest part of the wagon seat and was surveying the property as if taking inventory. As Nora stepped down, Emmett said quietly that he was grateful she had come. "Let us see how it goes." The first weeks were an education in a new landscape. The house had a rhythm she did not know yet, and she learned it the way she learned most things, by watching before doing. Ruth managed the kitchen with efficiency, but she was overwhelmed by the fieldwork and the animals, which had been Gerald's domain entirely, and she did not pretend otherwise. Nora knew livestock from her father's farm in Iowa, and she moved into the barn work without announcement, simply doing it, and after the first week, Ruth stopped looking surprised. The east fence was 3 rails down over a 20-foot stretch. Nora asked Emmett about the posts, and he told her 2 needed to be dug and reset. She said she could help. "You know fence work?" "I grew up on a farm, Emmett. They reset the posts on a Thursday morning while Ruth watched the younger children, and Clara followed Martha to the school in town. It was cold, and the ground was stiff but not yet frozen, and the work went well." They did not talk much during the digging, but during the break, when they were sitting on the rail eating the bread and cold bacon she had wrapped that morning, she told him about the farm in Iowa, and he told her about coming to Kansas as a young man with his first wife Margaret, who had grown up in Ohio and never quite forgave Kansas for not being Ohio. He said it with warmth, not grief. The kind of warmth that meant the grief had been carried long enough to settle. She told him about Thomas, about the creek and the high water, and the 3 days before they found him. He listened without filling the silence with anything unnecessary. "Clara remembers him," she said at last. "She does not say much about it, but she remembers. Samuel does not. He was 2 when Margaret died. That has its own kind of weight." The lantern she had set on the fence post between them caught the thin morning light and made a small warm circle around the bread and the tools, and the 2 of them sitting on the rail in the cold. She looked at it for a moment, and then looked back at the fence. "We should get the second rail up before the light shifts." He agreed, and they went back to work. The cough that James had developed in October moved through the younger children by November. Clara was hit hardest. For 4 days she ran a fever that did not break until the 5th morning, and during those days Nora barely slept. Ruth helped through the nights when Nora could no longer keep her eyes open, sitting with Clara while Nora rested for 2 or 3 hours, and then coming back. On the 4th night, Emmett sat outside the door of the room where Clara was sleeping and asked through the wood how she was doing. "The same," Nora told him. Was there anything he could get her? There was nothing to get. They waited. He said he would stay up, that if she needed anything he was in the main room. She reminded him that he had his own children to see to. "They are asleep, and Ruth is with them. I am here." She did not say anything more. She heard him settle into the chair in the hallway, the creak of the wood, and then quiet. Clara broke the fever before dawn on the 5th morning. Nora was holding her hand when the sweat came, and when Clara opened her eyes and announced she was hungry, Nora put her forehead down against her daughter's and stayed there for a moment with her eyes closed. When she came out into the hallway, Emmett was still in the chair, awake. The fever broke. He stood, and she could see the relief move across his face plainly. She thanked him for staying. "Of course. You did not have to." "I know." She looked at him in the gray, early light of the hallway, and something that had been held carefully behind her ribs for weeks shifted and found a slightly different place to rest. She told him she was going to make breakfast. He said he would help. November moved into December, and the cold settled over the farm with the permanence of a decision. The children had sorted themselves into a rough order. Martha and Clara were inseparable in the way of girls who have both been a little lonely for a long time. Samuel had appointed himself George's superior in all matters of exploration, and George had accepted this arrangement. James and Peter orbited the older children at a distance, occasionally admitted to specific games. Ruth mentioned one morning that she was sleeping better. She said she had not slept properly since Gerald took sick in August, and that having another woman in the house was the difference between managing and drowning. "You were not drowning. You were holding everything up." Ruth smiled at her. A small, tired smile. "That is what drowning looks like from the inside." On a Friday evening in the second week of December, after supper, after the children were in bed, Ruth went to her room early and left Nora and Emmett at the kitchen table with the last of the coffee and the lamp between them. Nora was mending a pair of Samuel's trousers. The knee had gone through again. Emmett was looking at the account book he kept for the farm, making notes. The lantern sat between them on the table, throwing its familiar circle of light. After a while, without looking up from the book, he observed that she had been there 2 months. She had. She had said she wanted a month to see if it was workable. She remembered. She had stayed past a month. She had. He looked up. He said he did not want to assume what that meant. He had said he would not call anything something it had not earned. But he wanted to ask her something. She set the trousers down. "Are you staying?" The lamp between them was burning low. Outside, the wind was making its winter run along the eaves. In the room at the end of the hall, Clara was sleeping in the bed she now shared with Martha. And from what Nora could piece together from the conversations she overheard, they had developed an entire private history involving a made-up town they called Willowmere, building it room by room in their imaginations. "I did not come all this way to leave, Emmett. I needed to hear you say it." "I know. There is something else." She waited. "I do not want you to be a housekeeper who stays. I want you to know that this farm is as much yours as it is mine, if you will have it that way. I am not offering a transaction. I am asking if you want to build something here. With me. With the children." Together, she looked at him across the lamp. "I know that is a large thing to ask. It is not too large." "Are you sure?" She held his gaze. "Emmett, I am sure." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the one that had been holding the mending needle, and his hand was warm and rough and steady. He did not move it. She did not move hers. They sat like that for a little while, with the lamp between them and the wind outside and the quiet sound of a house full of sleeping children around them. The minister came from Caldwell proper on a Saturday in January. It was not a large ceremony. Ruth stood beside Nora. Samuel stood beside his father, very serious, his hair wetted down for the occasion. Martha held George's hand to keep him from exploring the minister's bag. Clara stood between Martha and Nora, her hand in her mother's, watching everything with the careful attention she brought to all things. The minister was a stout man named Reverend Aldous Birch, who smelled of pipe tobacco and spoke the words with the particular warmth of a man who had said them many times and still meant them. He asked the questions, and they answered them, both of them looking at each other rather than at him. And when the brief ceremony was done, he shook Emmett's hand and told Nora she was welcome to the congregation, and took 2 pieces of Ruth's apple cake and a cloth for the road. There was no party. They ate supper together, all 7 of them, at the big table. Ruth had made a pot roast, and there were biscuits and the preserved green beans from the summer garden and a jar of the put-up peaches that Nora had brought from Hartwell, which she had been saving. George fell asleep at the table. James fell asleep shortly after. Samuel stayed awake through the apple cake and then admitted defeat. Clara helped Martha carry the dishes to the basin. Ruth spoke quietly, to no one in particular, and to both of them at once. This is better. She meant the table, the house, all of it. Yes, it is. Later, after the children were settled and Ruth had gone to her room, Nora and Emmett stood on the south porch in the January cold. The sky was clear, and the stars were the particular bright of a frozen night, sharp and close. He asked if she was warm enough. For the moment. They should go in soon, he said. In a minute. She was looking at the barn, at the shape of it against the stars, at the square dark of the fields beyond it, at the faint silver line where the fence ran east toward the Prentice property. She had never owned land. Before, her father had owned land, and Thomas had held a lease, and she had always been on land that belonged to someone else, which was a different thing from belonging to land. She was not sure yet what this feeling was. It was something like weight, but the good kind. The kind that kept you from blowing away. I want to put a kitchen garden on the north side, come spring, bigger than the one Ruth had. There is good sun there in the mornings. That is yours to do. I want Clara in school full days by March. Yes, and I want to learn the accounts. The farm accounts. I want to understand the numbers. I will show you everything. The cold was sharper now, and she let herself move closer to him, just a small step, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood there looking at the dark fields and the lit sky. She thought about the letter, the one she had read so many times the fold lines had gone soft. She did not have it anymore. She had thrown it into the kitchen stove the week she arrived, not in anger, but in the simple recognition that it had served its purpose. It had brought her here. What was here was not what the letter had promised, but it was more than she had let herself want. She had come west looking for a roof and a partner and a place where her work counted for something. The roof needed patching on the east side, and the accounts were not what they should be, and there were 6 children in the house, and it was January in Kansas, and the work ahead of her was real and long and without any particular ease. She had all of it. She had more than that. She had the lamp on the table and the sound of the children sleeping, and a man beside her who had driven a wagon a long way to tell the truth in person when a letter would have been easier. She had a kitchen garden planned in her mind for the north side of the house. She had a daughter who was building an imaginary town with a girl who needed a friend. She had land that would know her name by spring. She had been chosen, not because she was the only option, or the convenient one, or the one who arrived with the most to offer. She had been chosen because she had stayed past a month and told the truth and gone back to work every morning, and because a quiet man at a kitchen table had needed to hear her say it. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was the only thing she had ever really wanted, and she had not known how to name it until now. The lantern inside the kitchen window threw a warm square of light onto the porch boards at their feet. It was the same lantern from the fence post, from the hallway, from the table between them, on all those quiet evenings. She had moved it once by accident, and Emmett had moved it back without a word, and she understood now that it was something they both noticed, the light of it, the circle it made, the way it named a place as inhabited and warm. They went inside. She turned the lamp down but did not blow it out all the way. It kept a small flame, enough to see by, enough to mean something. That was how they ended the first night of the rest of it, with a small flame burning and the cold outside, and the house full and quiet around them.